So our final speaker for this session is Kathryn Perera, who is Head of Transformation at NHS Horizon. So Kathryn, come and join us on stage. Thank you.
Hello and good morning. My goodness, there are a lot of you. In his book, Why David Sometimes Wins, the great civil rights activist and farm workers organiser Marshall Gantz recounts the story of a small shepherd boy called David and his battle against Goliath, a great warrior. In that battle, it seemed that Goliath had all the resources of the whole world at his disposal, whereas David, slight of build, with no armour, no weapon, had only 5 smooth stones in his pocket. Yet with one action of startling precision, David slayed that giant, and in that process, he freed his people. This story that Marshall Gantz uses to open up an exploration of power and what it means to create social movements raises, I think, some questions that are still relevant today. How can those of us who are seemingly powerless against all the odds sometimes win? How do we challenge people when we feel that they have power over us and we want to reclaim or reframe what that power is? And how do we change powerful institutions that determine, in some cases, our very lives and reshape the dynamics at play? Now, in all of these questions, we're referring to power, and we use that word often, don't we? But I wonder how often we stop to check that we have a shared understanding of what we mean. I like Bertrand Russell's definition of power. So he was a philosopher, and he defined power simply as one's ability to achieve goals. And Martin Luther King used this definition and made it more action-focused. He said that power is about one's ability to achieve one's purpose. And one of the things that I like about both these definitions of power that they have in common is that they view power as a neutral concept, not good or bad inherently. And the question about power is the way that we use it, and it is through its use that it has an impact. Now, before I worked in the National Health Service, I ran an organisation called Movement for Change, and we worked right across the country to develop trainee community organisers to work in local communities. And time and again, whether we were working with students campaigning for a living wage on campus, or women who were looking at how they could tackle domestic abuse in their communities, there was a discomfort with this idea, with this word, power. And what it seemed to boil down to was an experience of power that was power over. The idea that people had an experience of power that was about domination rather than consent, and that was more about doing to than about building relationships. And it took time for us to explore with people the possibilities to see power as, in and of itself, a necessary and creative source for how we can make social change. So I'm going to give you a different frame for thinking about power, and this comes from the work of Jeremy Hymans and Henry Timms. So they founded many of the big social movements that are happening virtually over the last 10 years. Avaz, Get Up, Purpose, Move On, big crowdsourcing platforms. And what they've done in their writing on what they call new power is to distill down an idea of 2 frames, 2 lenses for thinking about power. So what they call old power is power as a currency. I have it, I give it to you, you have it. It's finite. It's about power being pushed down and commanded. So it operates primarily through hierarchy and structure. And what Jeremy and Henry do is to contrast this with what they call new power. Power as a current, an energy, something that we attract people into, something that we share through relationship, that is radically open and transparent. And what they suggest is that in the world today, the tension between these two ways of thinking about power is becoming more and more explicit. So let me put this from a different perspective. Shout out if you can tell me what this is. Tetris, good. I was going to say, I don't believe that you are all so young that you don't know what Tetris is, okay? So this is Tetris, right? This is the biggest game of the 90s. It's actually the biggest game of all time. And the way Tetris works is this. Blocks come down and they literally drop on your head at increasing speed, faster and faster and faster until you break down. Does that sound familiar? Okay, question number 2. Which one is this? Minecraft, thank you. Someone under 30. There we are. He's now smiling with embarrassment. Minecraft, right. So this is now the second biggest game of all time. And interestingly, it's also based on blocks. But it works very differently to Tetris. See, Minecraft starts with a green field. It starts with nothing. And everything that is built in that virtual world is built through a collaboration of people choosing, building, refining, coming together to literally create a world. And so what Jeremy and Henry are suggesting with new power is that we're seeing increasingly a tension between those of us who have been raised in a Tetris tradition and the values and expectations of those of us who are bringing a new sort of Minecraft mindset to the questions of power. So tension, I think, is an opportunity, okay? But it's only an opportunity if we better understand what the barriers might be to different ways of working. It's now 40 years since Professor John Gaventa talked about power in terms of having 3 faces. And I want to spend a moment on this because I think it's really valuable. He talked about a first face of power. That's visible power, okay? It's the idea that who gets to make the decisions are the people who sit at the table. So that's overt decision-making in public. It's about contestations and battles that we can see in public life. And it's about power that in varying degrees we can hold to account. But Gaventa says that there is a second face to power, what he calls hidden power. This is maybe a question of who even gets to decide who's at the table in the first place. Okay, so this face of power is much more about biases and exclusions, the things that keep us from accessing decision-making in the first place. Gaventa also offers a third face of power. It's what Jane referred to earlier. It's the so-called hidden face of power. This might be where we're unaware of our rights, where we don't feel able to exercise voice in pursuit of those rights. It could be characterized as forms of power where we feel that power over us is natural, or at least unchangeable, and therefore it's not even contested in public life. I would invite us in the work that we're going to do here today to keep those frames in mind and to think at each stage of what are we doing to open up the different faces of power. So to give an example of some of the questions we might ask ourselves, how do we bring others in with the ability to act that we have individually? And how do we explore how we make the sum of what we're doing far greater than the parts? And partly that's a question of permission. And as Jeff alluded to, partly it's a question of fear. So I want to leave you with one final thought. Often in the National Health Service, when we think about power and people, we look at it through an individual lens. Patient activation measures, personalization of care, self-care. And this is critical. It's critically important. But there is a second element, which is collective agency, how people act together, how we unite around common goals, how we build the skills and the confidence and the ability to realize our goals together. Alexis de Tocqueville, who is an extraordinary writer, from the 18th century. He visited the United States at the point at which it was being born as a democracy. And he said this, that knowledge of how to combine is the mother of all other types of knowledge. And on our progress depends that above all else. So I look forward to learning with you today how we get better at developing the confidence and skills to combine. Thank you.